Everyone. So we were talking about, well, on Wednesday we did the goddess movie, so now we switch back to politics, but you've got to keep in mind that those kinds of questioning about gender, about the relationship between state and society, that's all going on in the background during this time period. But we were talking about, going back a little bit as a review, we were talking about this thing called the Northern Expedition. Remember, that is led by Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang army. Right, they're going to march north. They're based in Canton and Guangzhou, so they're going to march north. These things work a lot better when you connect them. I got it. That's a pro tip for you all. These things work better when they're connected. So there we go. And this led to a limited unification of China. Now, from our perspective, it's not that unified, but we have to emphasize, when you think about the chaos of the warlord period, when there was a huge amount of fighting, right, cell phone should be put away. When there's a huge amount of fighting going on, right, there's lots of division. This was something different. Something did, in fact, change. Right, we have to keep that in mind. Something does, in fact, change with the northern advance. Now, again, I want to highlight, he doesn't get everything. He mostly brings his armies into the south, into the east. He doesn't get into Manchuria. He doesn't go to the west. But this is a real change. It's maybe not perfect, but this is much more unification than they had previously. Now, what happens then, you'll remember that his army, Chang's army, doesn't unify all of China. And in fact, his army itself is not unified. The Kuomintang party is not unified. Keep that in mind, right? So what happens is the nationalists and communists, remember the communists were allowed to join the Kuomintang party, the nationalist party. It's part of the deal. They help to take the city of Shanghai, but shortly after that, nationalist troops working with the mafia, the Green Gang, are going to round up and execute communists and others that they thought were enemies. This is several tens of thousands of people. And this will spread throughout the country. Remember, the communists won't take this city down. They will fight back as well. And I use this image, not to be shocking, but just to emphasize, this is what Chinese people were seeing in the streets. So things are getting a bit better, but there's still problems. Right? You know that something's wrong in society when this is going on in the street. I mean, it's not like this guy got a trial. Now, why did Chang do this? Remember, he doesn't need the communist help anymore. The communists were planning on doing the same thing eventually, and Chang knew it. In addition, there is a trip. Remember, Chang, this isn't just about power. I mean, power is important, but Chang really was anti-communist. He did not want class warfare. Remember, we talked about Marxism. Central to Marxism was class warfare. There's an oppressor class, there's an oppressed class, they're going to fight. Chang was primarily a nationalist. He did not want Chinese people killing Chinese people, unless he was the one doing it. But it was okay because he was unifying the country. Right? That was his perspective. But he didn't want Chinese people killing each other because of class. And he saw communism as essentially destructive of Chinese culture. And also, we'll see this, he was right to think this way. He connected communism with foreign influence. He said, we are not having our revolution so that we'll become the puppet of the Soviet Union. The foreign views of what's going on in this time period are interesting. Right? Remember, as the Nationalist Takeover, some people, Chinese people, will take advantage of this to say, yeah, let's kick out the foreigners. And we'll engage in tax on Western people, Japanese people, and Western businesses and government institutions. So it's kind of interesting. It says the foreign defense of Shanghai. Right? Westerners and Japanese will try and keep Shanghai, in a sense, for themselves, you could say, or at least prevent the nationalists from damaging their property. And you can see this, one reason they're suspicious, they're not sure who's in charge of the nationalists. Right? They've got the nationalist flag, but they've also got a communist flag. Remember, this is right before the massacre. This is right before Chang tramples on the communists, tries to stamp out their movement. And you can see here a similar puzzle, or similar kind of image. It says Kuomintang, that's the Nationalist Party. Right? That's the Nationalist Party. And you can see there's this guy writing it, who I think represents Chiang Kai-shek, and then Borodin, who you remember was the communist advisor from the Soviet Union. So the foreigners recognized there was a fight over who was going to be in charge of the Kuomintang. So like I said, it's divided. That's one reason why Chiang Kai-shek takes these steps and tries to crush it, tries to crush the communists. And then you can kind of see this too. I think it's very interesting here. By the way, the guy who wrote these comics, I believe, was a white Russian. If you're not familiar with white Russian, it's not just an alcoholic drink. It referred to a Russian person who was pro-Tsar, anti-communist, and had fled Russia by this time period, right? So this is a Russian who was anti-communist. He created this picture, which I think is very interesting. You see this Chinese woman watering the Three People's Principles. Remember, Sun Yat-sen had those Three People's Principles: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood, which was a kind of socialism. And she's watering that, and she says, this guy, you're welcome, you're Chinese, but keep your foreign friends out of here. Keep the communist influence out of here.
The picture is warm.
Yeah, exactly. So, in 1927 then, right, Chang has accomplished a lot. He has established the capital of the nationalist government in Nanjing. It's no longer in Beijing. That's not under his direct control. So he moves it to Nanjing. And it has a claim to be the capital because it was the old Ming capital. And Chang, because of his successes, is recognized as a leader of China and actually has a lot of respect. Not everyone likes Chang, but the situation he has created is better than what it had been. If you think about what happened after Yuan Shikai fell, right? That was complete chaos. He has been able to establish a somewhat effective central government, right? He's been able to establish a somewhat effective federal government. However, we're going to talk a lot about this, he has some weaknesses. He has to make peace with some warlords, and they get to keep their armies. Right? So remember, looking at this map, especially we're going to talk about this area up here as we go on. The Warlord of Manchuria got to keep his army. He got to basically run Manchuria. He accepted Chang as kind of his overlord, but he was calling the shots locally, and he had his own army, and his army tended to do what he told it to do, not what Chang told it to do. So that's what we mean about limited unification. But especially Manchuria, it's very important. And unfortunately for poor Chang, we call this the Nanjing decade, 1927-1937. He has a really short time to try and get China on its feet. Because if you've taken my, you may know this already, but if you take my class before, 1937, that's when Japan invades. Right, so while he's trying to build a government, China gets invaded. And that really messes up his efforts to do so. Now, I have to engage in a little bit of what's called historiography. One thing that I've had people literally say this to me, oh, history is a great thing to study because it doesn't change. It's completely false. It's true the past doesn't change, but how we understand the past changes. Sometimes new sources become available. Sometimes we get to understand things a bit better. And Chiang Kai-shek is an example of that. History does not remember Chiang kindly. Right? Well, you'll notice whenever that we watch a video clip about him, it's really hard on Chiang Kai-shek. And there's reasons for that. I'll give you reasons. Like, it's not completely off base to be critical of this guy. There are lots of things you can criticize. He could be really brutal. Right? So, for example, remember this was from the readings. One of the readings we did, it showed Chang with a big fist and a tiny head. Right? Which is a joke. This guy is someone who doesn't really think. He just is violent. That's how he tries to solve his problems. But the fact is, they weren't punished for making this comic. So it raises the question, well, how brutal or how effective was his brutality that people could do this? The press was largely free and could criticize Chiang Kai-shek. In communist-controlled areas, the press was never free and was certainly not allowed to criticize the party, whereas Chang was often criticized. And that's one reason why people are critical of him today, because there are people who wrote bad things about him. And one thing I have to be fair, some of those things were true. It didn't help that his personality, he was just a quiet guy. He didn't like to talk. In fact, one interesting thing, he didn't really speak Mandarin well. He spoke Cantonese. He didn't speak Mandarin well. So he didn't really have all that much charisma. He had a hard time communicating. Remember, Mao Zedong was very good at communication. Chiang Kai-shek, not so much. And one thing that happens, the Americans, we will support him in the Chinese Civil War and during World War II, and then the communists win the Chinese Civil War, and so we just put all the blame on him. Very convenient for us, right? We didn't do anything wrong. It was all Chiang Kai-shek, right? Anything that goes in China that doesn't go the way we want to go, we just blame Chiang Kai-shek, so we don't have to take the blame ourselves. What's interesting, if you're really interested in Chiang Kai-shek, our library has a book about Chiang Kai-shek written by an Indian who's a British citizen. So it's a guy from India who's a British citizen writing about the guy. So I love his book because he tends to be very even-handed. He doesn't have the same baggage an American or a Chinese person would have approaching this. My perspective is that I think he played a bad hand really well. By hand, I mean cards. I don't think he was dealt a very good hand. And he did the best he could. But when you look back at it, it's hard to think how he could have done things differently. The guy really is in a bad position. Just one of those days. Goodness. Okay. So to talk a little bit more about his regime, and to give you a sense now that I've raised a historiographical issue, I want to play a clip of a documentary that's hard on Chang, but also has a lot of good information. And by the way, do you remember we read that, the Good Earth segment? They interview the author, because she knew Chang. So it's kind of cool. You get to see Pearl Buck.
First, new face enters his life. The beautiful Mei Ling Song, sister of Madame Sun Yat-sen, American-trained, Wellesley educated. Chang takes her hand in marriage. She is to be a major shaping influence in all his future thinking. By 1929, Chang has built a majestic mausoleum for Sun Yat-sen at his new capital, Nanking. There, the body of the hero is brought. Pearl Buck remembers that day.
Chiang Kai-shek came in and roused great hopes in everyone. I remember the first time I ever saw him was at the funeral of Sun Yat-sen 4 years after Sun Yat-sen died. His embalmed body was brought to Nanking to be buried in a great new tomb on the mountain there. It's the first time I saw him face to face. A very striking man with very striking, bold black eyes. And he had a presence. And I think that he might have been a great first emperor if there had been a throne to sit upon. That was the tragedy, that the very structure of government was destroyed by the revolution, so that there wasn't a government. And he had to begin that government from the bottom, and he didn't understand government. He was a soldier, and he didn't know how to make a government. And he had plenty of advisors, most of them young PhDs from the United States, very impractical and idealistic, and they didn't know how to make a government. And all the time he had the communists to fight, and he also had the Japanese threatening. And it was a very difficult situation. I'm never inclined to blame him.
To Westernize, this soldier's rule seems like the first firm government of China in many years. Jiang too was changing, for his wife, as much American in thought as Chinese, leads him to see the United States as friend, a source of loans and help. As new railways stretch their tracks across the country, the new Comintern order Chang has brought begins to offer comfort and luxuries to the cities he controls. Industry booms, production soars. Engineers and young industrialists find, for the first time, careers opening to modern talents. Universities flourish, parade their graduates full of hope. In cities, department stores begin to offer Chinese, taste of every modern wear. Modern dress takes subtle hold on Chinese fashion, while rich Chinese, in centers like Shanghai, begin enjoying privileges until now saved for foreigners.
All right. So that gave us kind of a sense, right, of what's going on in this time period. There's some negative things, but there's also a lot of hope, right? Things are starting to develop again now that we have more peace and order. Not complete peace and order by any means, but more of it. And I do agree somewhat with what Pearl Buck said. She is right. He faces a very difficult situation, especially starting in the 1930s, particularly when Japan invades in 1937. But to say he was idealistic and didn't understand anything about government, I think is not correct. We'll talk more about that shortly. But I want to give you a sense of what I mean. This is why he does have a reputation that's somewhat negative, right? And I think that's deserved to a certain extent. So this is the emergency law he issued in 1931. These are crimes deserving capital punishments. These are crimes you can be executed for. So let's have a look at some of these. Disturbing peace and order. Whoa, that's really broad, isn't it? Right? Disturbing peace and order you can be executed for. If you live in the dorms, couldn't some of your neighbors be executed for disturbing peace and order? I mean, seriously, right? That's a very broad category. But not only that, entering into a secret relationship with a foreign country in order to disturb peace and order, that sounds really broad. Basically, being a communist. Right? That basically means being a communist, right? Associating with rebels in order to disturb peace and order. So if I have a beer with a communist, I could legally be shot. If I'm lucky. Right? I mean, this is very broad, right? Associating with rebels in order to disturb peace and order. Because I'm just curious, what do you mean by associating? I say, you have a beer with a guy? Is that enough to be associating? And then conducting a campaign of propaganda against the state. And I do believe the capitalization was in the original. The state, capitalized. By writing, sketching. Oh, so be careful, Max and Armir and our other art majors, or speech making. Though if it's not too bad, if your drawing's good, you may not be killed. You may just get life imprisonment.
How does that tie into the free press that you mentioned about earlier in the previous slide?
Yeah, I mean, it's free as long as you don't do these things. So it's a very limited free press.
Okay.
It's not you don't want to think of it like free press, not free press. It's freer than it was in communist areas. Some of that was because of what Chang believed. Some of it was because he never had enough control to do anything about it. So even though there's the law, it doesn't mean it's always enforced. But the fact is, this creates a legal basis for killing communists for being communists. And also, I say, it is restrictive. If someone makes him mad, he can act against them. So this is one reason why you've got pictures like this, and they're not completely wrong. Right? It's not a completely unreasonable thing. And I don't want to take away, this guy could be very brutal. Right? He was. But here's, I think, kind of a better reflection than what Pearl Buck gave us. Before concluding that this was no way to run a government or an army, it is worth reflecting on how strong institutions come into being. Through no fault of their own, the nationalists lacked strong governmental institutions. Their government was simply too new to have any, but they were trying to create some. Institutions become strong over time through the gradual and increasing acceptance of their legitimacy or a perception of their invincibility by a growing proportion of the population. Strong institutions derive their strength from general acceptance and general compliance. Before the acceptance and compliance become general, however, the spider's web remains vulnerable to destruction, particularly in wartime. When opposing sides sweep aside the laws and institution process of their enemies. Institution building process of their enemies. With the collapse of not only the Qing dynasty, but the entire dynastic system of government, the nationalists inherited an institutional vacuum. So remember, the old government was destroyed. He's trying to build a new government. That's really hard to do. He's trying to bring in all these new policies. He's trying to make all these changes. And people are kind of like, well, you're the new government. Maybe we'll have another new government tomorrow. Right? Didn't Yuan Shikai rule for a time, then go away? Weren't these warlords in charge and didn't they go away? How do we know you're going to last? So people aren't necessarily going to listen to him. That's one reason he's kind of brutal, because people aren't listening to him. But he needs time to do this. If he had time, he could develop strong institutions that would be considered legitimate. Everything would be fine. He doesn't have the time to do it. So one thing we have to understand when judging Chiang Kai-shek historically, if this guy had more time, he could have done things rather differently. But he's got to deal with the Civil War and a Japanese invasion. So, it's just not enough time. Now, Pearl Buck was, like I said, was kind of hard on Chang, said he didn't really have a vision. It was too naive. He did. Right? He did have a vision of what the new China should look like. It was close to the Three People's Principles. He was serious about following Sun Yat-sen's program. Nationalism, democracy, eventually, and, of course, a kind of people's livelihood. So he wanted a strong, independent China that was democratic, and had land reform. He was pro-land reform. He just didn't want class struggle. South Korea, for example, had land reform. People who had a lot of land were forced to sell it. They got money for it, but they were forced to sell it. And farmers who didn't have enough land were allowed then to buy it from the government at low prices. That is land reform without class conflict. You're not criticizing the landlords. You're paying them for their property, maybe not as much as they would like, but they get something. They certainly don't die. So don't think of him as just like pro-capitalist. People often make that mistake. He wasn't. He really wanted this kind of people's livelihood. He just didn't want Chinese people to kill each other to do it. Unless he was doing the killing. That was okay because he was killing for the new China. Right? There's a kind of a problem. And he wanted a new China that was both modernized, but that continued the old culture. So I would categorize him as a modern Confucian Christian. Right? I would categorize him as a modern Confucian Christian. I'll get to the Christian part shortly. But his idea was just to modernize Confucianism. And you can remember how you had to do that reading on the New Life movement, where he was talking about, there's these kinds of people, we don't have enough, the problem with us Chinese is we don't have enough spirit, we need to work on developing that spirit. That's Confucianism that's modern. He was taking Confucian ideas and trying to make them modern. And that same Russian who was making those other comics, he made this one that was talking about people's reactions to the New Life movement. It's just funny. It's this young lady who's just like, oh no, now I have to change my clothes. It's just kind of funny. And I just love this guy's art style. It's really good. So the New Life movement, right? You read the clip, the section on it, so I don't want to go too much into it. Remember, it's kind of a Confucian modernization, right? Remember, Chinese people really, and Koreans too, and Japanese really emphasize proper etiquette. And they understood, right, if you get people to follow the rules of politeness, if you get people to have a healthy culture, everything else will follow. Right? If you have a healthy culture, you'll have a healthy government. You'll have a healthy society. So they had rules like this. Your clothes should be clean and tidy. Your buttons should be buttoned properly. Okay, I don't mind. Do not throw food on the ground. Be punctual for appointments. That's modernization. I should point out one thing when Japan was trying to modernize, they always had a problem. This is like the 1870s in Japan. The day after payday, no one showed up to the factory because they took their money that they got paid and all got drunk and were hungover and couldn't work. You have to train people to be punctual. People aren't naturally punctual. Stay in line at a station when buying tickets. People had to be taught to do that. That's part of being modern. If you've ever been someplace where people don't wait in line, it's crazy. Salute the national flag when it's raised and brought down. We're encouraging patriotism. Be filial to your parents and love your brothers and sisters. That's very Confucian. That's what I mean about Confucian. Exterminate rats. Communists, by the way, will be really good at exterminating rats. I mean, literally, like killing rats, they're really good at it. We'll talk a lot about that later. Get vaccinated. And I've kind of chosen these rules, not at random, but to show you just how far-reaching they were and how broad they were. Now, what happens is, are you trying to ask a question, Dylan?
Yeah. So that's where the whole killing the rats and the pests from our reading comes from, right?
Yeah, you've read really far ahead. So you'll read about this later. But yeah, the rats carry disease, and you can mobilize people and kill them, so then they can't carry disease anymore. But so that's just they're reacting a similar way. But good point. Now, what happens is some people look at this and say, oh, Chiang Kai-shek is anti-communist. He believes in these things. He must be a fascist, right? Fascist. If you're not familiar with fascism, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini were both fascists. It's a kind of political ideology. I'm not going to go too far into it, except to say people are basically trying to say that Chiang Kai-shek was like Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. And I disagree with that for a couple of reasons. But one reason people think that way is because the picture's like this. This is a kind of propaganda picture. This is a young lady in a Chinese military uniform. Why might this make people think that, he was a fascist? Yeah, Nick?
The helmet?
Yeah, the helmet. She's wearing a German helmet. That's because, remember how Sun Yat-sen had to turn to the Soviet Union because no one else was helping? Chiang Kai-shek turned to the Germans in the 1930s because no one was helping. He did this before the rise of the Nazis, by the way. I'm not sure if it would have mattered much, but he did this before the Nazis came to power. And I would argue, if you want to understand Chiang Kai-shek, he's not fascist. He's a Confucian Christian. Right? Remember how we talked about, this is all very Confucian, but remember how we talked about how you had these Protestant thinkers who argued that by accepting Christianity, you weren't just accepting certain beliefs about Jesus, but that Western democracy and Western strength was built on Christianity, that Christianity inherently encourages freedom and democracy and all those things. Chiang Kai-shek believed that. Right? Chiang Kai-shek believed that. And it's really striking. So do you remember how he talked about his wife in that movie clip we watched? His wife was a Christian. Her family wanted him to convert to Christianity to marry her. And he said, I can't promise that, but I will study it. I'll think about it. And the fact is, he did think about it. So it's unfair to say this guy was kind of a nitwit. He wasn't. He wasn't dumb. He read through the Bible twice. He studied it for about a year. And he ended up becoming a Christian and getting baptized. So he was serious. Right? He wasn't just doing this to gain some kind. He got what he wanted. He got to marry the woman. But he was serious. He said, I want to think about this. And to give you an example, this is one reason why I talk about historiography changing. Chiang Kai-shek's private journals were classified for many decades. I think in the early 2000s they were finally released. So people were able to read his private journals. This is something from his private journal. This is something no one was meant to read. Believers in Jesus must control themselves, endure insults, and be patient in suffering. Every day they must bear the cross along with Jesus. So in many ways, this guy could be brutal. He killed a lot of people. He certainly did all those things. We can't take that away. But he was a deep thinker, and he was sincere in trying to build this Confucian kind of Christianized Chinese culture. Fascists don't write things like this, right? They may say things like this in public. Remember, this was private. This was a private document. This is something he was writing for himself. So interesting guy, Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, before we continue, a few announcements. Remember, the review quiz 8 and reading quiz 7 will be due Sunday, 11:59 p.m. They should both be open after this class. I apologize. I sent out an email yesterday because I made some mistakes. I think they're all rectified. If they're not, please email me. We will hopefully start section 8 on Monday. Remember, short paper 2 is due by 11:59 p.m. Monday. If you want I handed out the assignment sheets on Wednesday. If you did not get one, please come see me after class. I'll be happy to give you one. They're also online if you should have lost yours. So do remember to do that. If you look at the schedule, I'm delaying reading quiz 8 a week. We had kind of a week where there was no reading quiz, so I'm pushing it back because it won't be connected enough to the lecture. Right? You'd be reading too far ahead, so I've delayed that a week. But review quiz 9 will take place as normal, so only the reading quiz is being delayed a week. Yes, Dylan.
So next week we'll have reading quiz 9, right? Right.
No, it's delayed a week. I'd have to look at the schedule. It's delayed a week, so don't worry. Basically, I don't want to talk too much about it because I'll just confuse people because we have another reading quiz due on Sunday. So if you look at the schedule, that's pushed back a week. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm sorry, if I do too much, I'm worried I'll confuse you. I just want you to know that's delayed a week, so you don't have to immediately start reading that. So kind of continuing, if we look at Chang's dilemma, right? From 1927 to 37, he looks so strong, but in each strength he has a weakness. Right? So we want to understand Chang during this time. On the face of it, in terms of number, he controls a huge army. But only 5 to 10% of the army is directly loyal to him. Only 5 to 10% are troops that he commands directly. And he will constantly have problems where he'll tell generals to do stuff, and they won't do it. So that's a weakness. Also, he has to support that army. He has to keep a big army to keep everyone in line, because if he doesn't have a big army, he can't get people to do what he wants because of this problem. Right? A lot of people just don't accept him as being legitimate. And the warlords have their own armies. So if he doesn't have a big army, no one will listen to him, and so he has to plow money into his army instead of economic development. He has some Western support. Remember they mentioned the video clip that some people say, yeah, he's brought a strong government. He's brought peace and order. That's great. But the Western support is comparatively weak. We'll talk about some exceptions, but for the most part, they maintain unequal treaties. Until 1943, the United States and Britain in particular, we have unequal treaties with China until 1943. So we're not willing to give him that much. We want to protect our own economic interests, especially during the Great Depression. China actually starts to do well economically right before the Great Depression, and then the Great Depression hits and the United States closes its doors to imports, and of course that hurts the Chinese. Also hurts the Japanese too. He does have support from the urban middle and upper classes and the landlords, especially in the cities. That seems good. But remember, they're not the strong classes. One thing about Mao Zedong that makes him such a genius was he realized that the powerful class were the peasants. He has a strong claim to Sun's legacy. Remember, he built that big tomb to Sun Yat-sen in Nanjing, and he presented himself as Sun Yat-sen's successor. But others would claim Sun. Sun Yat-sen's wife hated Chiang Kai-shek and actually supported the communists. I think she even gave secrets to the communists, right? So he's not the other one. The communist other factions can also claim Sun. He has a lot of prestige from unification, especially, he will lose that quickly, as we'll talk about. His wife and his wife's family help him a lot. His wife, Sun Mei-ling, we'll talk more about her later. She speaks perfect English. And she's great at building a relationship with the United States. We give the Chinese a lot of support, especially when they're at war with the Japanese. The problem is her family and she herself are really corrupt. Chiang Kai-shek himself seems to have been personally honest and efficient. He was brutal and would totally kill you if you got in his way, but he really did care about China and was not interested in making money. His wife and her family were, and they were corrupt as all get out. And that hurt him a lot. So it appears that he's in power. But his power is limited by the factionalism that he faces. There's lots of people who would like to replace him, and by the weakness of the state. So this guy is in a terrible situation. But things are starting to improve. He begins to reverse territorial fragmentation. He's slowly unifying the China under his control. He's slowly rebuilding unity. He does regain tariff autonomy. Remember how we talked about the unequal treaties forced Chinese to have low tariffs, which impacted their ability to collect taxes to get money for infrastructure? Tariffs, remember, are taxes you charge in imports. Chinese were forced to keep those low, which meant they couldn't protect their own industries, and they couldn't raise money easily. Now they're allowed to do that. They're able to successfully renegotiate those treaties, and they gain control over their maritime customs service. Right? You may remember for a long time, a British guy, Sir Robert Hart, was in charge of the customs service. Now Chinese people are. They engage in legal reforms. Remember how they made a big deal of that? Remember how in that video we watched about the woman, the goddess who killed the guy? She went to a court. It didn't look like a Western-style court. That was part of the legal reforms that they underwent, which convinced Westerners to give up extraterritoriality. So now if you're an American and you commit a crime in China, you're not tried by Americans, you're tried by Chinese. So that's an accomplishment. The infrastructure, there's economic growth they talked about, especially in the cities. Infrastructure develops. There's more roads, there's more railroads being built. And strikingly enough, in the Constitution, there's protection of gender equality. There's a Constitution that's passed in 1931. And later basic rights, such as freedom of speech and freedom of religion, are protected within limits. Right, within limits. So he's building a regime that's working. It does tend to favor the middle and upper classes. That's going to be a weak point, but it is working. And I want to stress, what Chiang Kai-shek is doing here, if you look at Japan in like the 1870s and 80s, that's what he's doing. So if you took my modern Japan class, this is kind of where we're at. It's just Japan isn't going to face an invasion and civil war. Chiang Kai-shek will. That's where the communists come in. So we talked earlier about communist theory, as we talked about the development of communism in China. In 1903, the first reference, the actual first kind of communist work is translated into Chinese. There's a brief excerpt from the Communist Manifesto published in China in 1903. Chinese weren't too interested in communism until 1918, after the Russian Revolution. Right? The Russians had their revolution in 1917. The communists will eventually come to power. And in New Youth, that very important journal, there will be a article published on communism. It's called the Victory of Bolshevism. That's another word for the Russian Soviet Union communists. And they learn about this from Chinese sources. Or, I'm sorry, from Japanese sources. Very interesting, right? A lot of times the Chinese get their news from Japan. And one thing I have to stress, and this is very important, so it's not going to sound important, but it's very important as we go on. In the Russian Communist Revolution, remember, Marx said that the first revolution would be like in Britain, be an industrialized country. It didn't happen in an industrialized country. It happened in a semi-industrialized country, Russia. Why? Lenin, this guy here, organized the Communist Party as a vanguard. We're not going to wait for the workers to revolt. We're going to organize them. We're going to have a small, highly disciplined political party, Communist Party, that will lead the workers, and then they'll seize power. And that's what they did. In the Russian Communist Revolution, workers, led by the Communist Party, there were never that many of them, seized power, and they did that in the cities first. So the communist revolution in Russia was urban. And the major people moving the revolution were workers. And I don't mean agricultural workers, I mean factory workers. Whenever I say worker, I mean a person in a factory. Someone not an agricultural worker, someone in a factory. So that's the Russian experience. Who will bring the revolution? Workers led by the Communist Party. Where will it be? It will be in the cities. The Comintern. The Comintern is a group set up by the Soviet Union to spread communism. It stands for Communist International. They will send agents in 1919 to China to try and actually help establish a communist party. They focus on Beijing University, then called Peking University, especially Chen Duxiu, the guy who started New Youth. Shortly after that, 1920, a group of Chinese people interested in communism will start meeting here in Shanghai. And in 1921, in Shanghai, they do this in Shanghai because it's under foreign protection, so they're able to meet freely. I think they actually did this in the French concession. Remember, Chen Duxiu was a Francophile. He loved the French, I mean. In 1921, they actually found the Chinese Communist Party. And their initial document, this is key, and please bear with me for a moment because it gets very complex, but their initial document, when they found their new Chinese Communist Party, is they say, we must have a complete revolution, one that accepts no compromise. Who are we going to work with? Communists. We're not working with anyone else. We're going to have a communist revolution, and we're going to bring communism. That's what we're going to do. The Comintern agents say, no, you're not ready for that. China's not in a state where it can have its own revolution on its own. There's not enough of you. You have to work with other people. You have to work with the nationalists and other political parties. So they change. Why? The Comintern has resources that the Chinese communists need. So there's a kind of friction here. Constantly, as we'll see, representatives from the Soviet Union tell the Chinese communists to do something. Chinese communists don't want to do it necessarily, but these guys have the money. They've got the guns. They've got the advice. You've got to listen to them. So then the Chinese communists are pressured into working with the KMT, the nationalists. That didn't work out for them, did it? So keep that in mind. Right? I want to stress here. Chinese communists often want to do something their own way. The Soviet communists will say, you can't do that. You got to do it this way, based on Soviet experience. The Chinese will go along with it because they don't have a choice, and it doesn't go well for them. Right? They work with the nationalists, they obey the Communist International, they obey the Soviet Union, and they get massacred by Chiang Kai-shek. So keep that in mind. So here's the thing, right? So far, when you're looking at this, you'd be like, well, how the heck are there any, how did the communists come into power? Right? I mean, Chiang Kai-shek is willing to kill thousands of these people, and he's building a government that's kind of working. So how do these people get in power? So one thing we have to look at, first of all, is why would people be attracted to communism despite violent suppression? It's interestingly enough, right? I'm teaching History 121, I'm doing the rise of Christianity, and I ask the question, why do people become Christian when they can get killed for becoming Christian? Well, we have a similar thing. Why do people become communists when they can be killed for being communists? Right? Why are people doing that? So what are the attractions despite violent suppression? Right? We'll see that hopefully answered somewhat in this video, hoping that it works properly.
In spite of the security police, the communists began to rebuild support in cities where working conditions were often brutal. In factories, child labor was common. In silk production, very young children worked plucking cocoons from boiling water.
I came to Shanghai when I was 12.
Same footage, by the way.
You had to work 17 hours a day. Later, a progressive worker in a factory told us that people were not born to be poor. One was poor because of the exploitation by others. There is exploitation by the capitalist on one hand, and exploitation by the labor contractor on the other. You do the work, and he takes the money. I had no idea what revolution meant. All I thought was that the worker made sense, and that he cared about us poor people. Well, he said, there is a country where there is no oppression and no exploitation, where everybody has a job and food. All we dreamed of then was of having food. So when we heard of this country, we wondered where it was. If only our country could be like that. That's what we hoped for. So we liked to listen to him, and we felt we could do whatever he told us. We would follow him even if we had to risk our lives. What country was that? He wouldn't tell us which country it was. It wasn't until later we knew that what he referred to was the Soviet Union.
Chinese communist leaders believed that the revolution would be led, as Marx had written, by workers in the cities.
Okay, so we're running a little bit low on time, and I'm not quite almost there. Okay, very good. So I'm going to have to answer this question myself, but the key thing is, because for a lot of workers, life is really bad, right? I mean, she's talking about, I was 12, I was working 17 hours a day, right? The work conditions were often very bad, they were often paid very poorly, the people who were in charge often figured out ways to confiscate your wages. It was just really bad. They didn't mention it there, but if you were a woman, it was very easy to be sexually abused by your foreman, by your supervisor. Couldn't do anything about it. There were so many poor people that you couldn't really challenge the system because they would just fire you and hire someone else. So things were really, really bad for many workers. And when your life is that hard, when you're working 17 hours a day, I might as well rebel because I'm going to die from this anyhow. So the key thing is, because some people are suffering a great deal under this newly developing economy, they're willing to look to communism because their lives are just that bad. And we have to stress, there is development in China, but it's uneven. The development, the industrialization that's happening in China tends to profit people who are wealthy, who are middle class, and skilled workers the most. If you're educated, if you're skilled, you're going to do quite well. You're hard to replace. You perform a very important function. But if you're semi-skilled or unskilled, it can be very difficult. And it's principally among this group of people that communists will have the opportunity to rebuild. So you can crush the communists in 1927, but you don't kill them all. And the ideas are still there. And as long as this situation, as long as this economic situation continues, there will always be people who are attracted to it, because remember, communism explains this economic situation and offers a solution to it. So of course people are going to be attracted to this idea. And especially, like they said, this guy said there's another place where this kind of thing doesn't happen. Wouldn't it be great to be like that other place? And of course we all know that everyone in the Soviet Union had enough to eat, unless you live in Ukraine. Sorry, history. So the communists are going to rebuild, but what strategy should they follow? That's kind of the big thing here. They tried this urban thing, and it was crushed. Right? It was crushed in 1927. They're willing to try it again, but others say, do we have to do this? Isn't there another way? Do we have to do it just like the Soviet Union did? I mean, the Soviet Union, technically speaking, isn't following Marx. Right? Remember, Marx said it was just going to be this broad group of people that would rebel when a civil or a country became enough advanced in its capitalism. That's not Russia. That's not what happened in Russia at all. So we don't have to follow the Russian example. Maybe we should apply Marx our own way. And the guy who figured out how to do that was a guy named Mao Zedong. He said, I don't agree with this whole urban stuff. I don't think this makes sense. And to give you a sense, like I said, this guy is a poet as well as a revolutionary. He wrote this in 1927, right? And he argues we should focus on the peasants, we should focus on the countryside. He writes, the present upsurge of the peasant movement is a colossal event. In a very short time in China's central, southern, and northern provinces, several 100 million peasants will rise like a mighty storm, like a hurricane, a force so swift and violent that no power, however great, will be able to hold it back. They will smash all the shackles that bind them and rush forward along the road to liberation. They will sweep all the imperialist warlords, corrupt officials, local tyrants, and evil gentry into their graves. That's pretty moving talk, right? Like I said, this guy's a poet. But not only is he a poet, able to communicate very complex ideas very simply, he has correctly identified the possible revolutionary force. Karl Marx, like I said, literally called peasants a sack of potatoes. They just sit there and they don't do anything. Mao doesn't think that way at all, and he's correct. Right? He thinks that the peasants are the ones who will change things. And just to give you a sense, again, this guy's brilliance. I want to stress, I'm not a big fan of Mao. But I'm a historian, I have to try and explain, why this guy is so important, and he is. Because not only can he write things like this, he engages in sociological work like this. So in 1930, he investigated a county, and he wanted to understand how the economy worked. And he classified the people. Right? Remember, communism says that history is driven by the economy. And so he went around and classified the people. He said landlords, who are landlords, are people who own so much land that they can't work at all. Okay, that's a landlord. Who are rich peasants? They don't have so much land that they can really rent it out, but they grow more food than they need, and they can loan it out. So they're rich peasants. That's the class that Mao was from himself. Middle peasants, those are peasants who have enough food to eat. They're getting by. That's 18%. Poor peasants, they don't have enough food to eat. They rely on loans. Notice that's the vast majority of people. That's why he identifies them correctly as the class that will change things. If you could organize 70% of the population, things are going to get done. Laborers were 3%. AQ was a laborer until he became a loafer when no one would hire him. So here's the thing, and this is again Mao's genius. He could be very evocative, very moving. He can get you excited about revolution, but he's a very careful person who classifies people in this way to understand how the system works. But he does it in a very simple way, right? You don't have to be particularly educated to understand this, right? The classification is not complex. It's very simple. It makes a lot of sense. Mao also supported a policy of guerrilla war. Right? Mao thought the best kind of warfare was guerrilla war. Don't try and stand up to the nationalists and fight them toe-to-toe. You'll probably lose. But if we control the countryside, which is the vast majority of the people, the cities can't exist. The armies can't exist. This is an example. This is a rare picture of one of Mao's armies. So the key thing is this, right? Mao thought, so the key thing is this here. The Soviets, the Russians, the communists, and the Soviet-fluted Chinese wanted to replicate a Russian revolution which was primarily urban and primarily led by the workers. Mao Zedong thought that it should be led by the peasants, that they were the motive force. So there's a big theoretical difference among the communists. We'll pick up with that on Monday, and we should be able to get to section 8. I hope, yep, we should. So I'll see you all then. Rex, do you mind, are you able to email that to me? Are you able to send that as a link?
I think so.
Like if it's something you can do in like 30, it's like really easy, you know how to do it.